The sweet aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods was a hallmark of Bryant's Cafe, a small but thriving corner establishment in the heart of Malcolm Bryant's neighborhood. For years, it had been more than just a business, it was a sanctuary. Locals came not only for the food but for the sense of community Malcolm had cultivated. A college student could sit in the corner with her books, an elderly man could share stories of the past, and a group of teenagers could plot their futures, all under the same roof. But tonight, the cafe was no sanctuary. It was gone, consumed by an inferno that had reduced years of hard work to smoldering ash. Malcolm stood on the sidewalk, trembling, as the fire roared before him. His cafe, his life's work, was engulfed in flames. The once welcoming sign above the door hung crooked, half consumed by the fire. The heat radiated against his face, and for a moment, he was too stunned to cry. "Bryant, you really thought this place would last? Huh?" A voice sneered from behind. Malcolm turned to see two familiar figures, Officer Blake and Officer Turner. They stood casually by their squad car, arms crossed, their smirks cutting deeper than any words. Blake tilted his head and laughed. "Look at him cry." Malcolm's fists clenched, but his body betrayed him, frozen in place. He could only watch as the officers mocked him. Blake raised his phone, snapping a photo of the burning building. Turner leaned against the car, his laughter echoing over the crackle of the flames. "You should have stayed in your lane, Malcolm," Turner said. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that Malcolm couldn't ignore. This wasn't the first time the two officers had harassed him. They'd issued frivolous citations, parked their squad car conspicuously in front of his cafe to scare off customers, and made veiled threats every chance they got. But this was different. This was personal. A crowd began to gather, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of the fire. Some held phones, recording the scene, while others whispered among themselves. A woman in the crowd, her voice trembling with anger, yelled out, "This ain't right. Someone call the fire department." "They're already on their way," Malcolm muttered, his voice hollow. But deep down he knew it was too late. The fire had devoured everything. A neighbor, an older man named Mr. Jenkins, approached and placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, son. We all know what this place meant to you, and to all of us." Malcolm nodded silently, his eyes still locked on the flames. The fire department eventually arrived, but their efforts felt more like an afterthought. By the time they extinguished the flames, there was nothing left but a skeleton of charred wood and twisted metal. As the firefighters packed up, one of them approached Malcolm and offered an apology. "Fire looks deliberate," the firefighter said, lowering his voice. "But you didn't hear that from me." Deliberate. The word echoed in Malcolm's mind, confirming what he already suspected. He looked at the scorched remains of his cafe and felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him. It wasn't just about losing his business. It was about losing a place that had brought people together, a place that had defied the odds in a world that wasn't built for people like him to succeed. As Malcolm stood in the wreckage of his dreams, a faint laugh carried over the wind. He turned to see Blake and Turner driving away, their laughter audible even over the distant sirens. A sick feeling churned in his stomach. After the crowd dispersed, Malcolm walked home alone. The quiet streets felt heavier than usual, the shadows deeper. When he reached his doorstep, he found a message spray-painted across the front of his house. "Stay in your place." Malcolm stared at the words, his fists trembling at his sides. He could feel the anger boiling beneath his grief, a righteous fury that demanded action. For years, he had worked to build something meaningful, to create a space where his community could thrive. And in one night, it was all taken from him. As he stepped inside, Malcolm sat in the dark and tried to collect his thoughts. His initial instinct was to give up, to retreat, to stay in his place as the message demanded. But as the hours passed and the sun began to rise, another thought took hold. He wouldn't stay in his place. He couldn't. For too long, people like him had been told to be silent, to endure, to accept injustice. But Malcolm wasn't built for silence. If they thought they could intimidate him into submission, they were wrong. As dawn broke over the city, Malcolm stood and looked out the window at the charred skyline where his cafe once stood. The fire hadn't just destroyed his business. It had ignited something inside him. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, staring at the faded photograph of his late father. The older man, a civil rights activist in his youth, had once told him, "Son, strength isn't in how you take a hit. It's in how you stand back up." Malcolm's fists tightened around the edges of the photo as those words resonated in his mind. He had been hit harder than ever before, but he wasn't about to stay down. The morning after the fire, Malcolm stood on the sidewalk outside his destroyed cafe. Blackened wood and ash crunched beneath his feet as he surveyed the ruins. Around him, the neighborhood stirred to life. Faces filled with concern appeared from windows and doorways, neighbors stepping outside to see how he was holding up. Malcolm called Mrs. Diaz from her stoop across the street. "I brought some coffee. Thought you might need it." "Thank you," Malcolm replied, managing a weak smile. Others gathered around him, offering words of comfort and support. Teenagers from the high school volunteered to help clean up, while elders expressed their sorrow for the loss of a place that had become a second home to so many. Malcolm felt a flicker of hope. The cafe may have been reduced to rubble, but the spirit of community it fostered was still alive. Among the crowd was Jada, a sharp-witted college student Malcolm had mentored. She approached him with her laptop tucked under one arm and determination blazing in her eyes. "I've been digging," Jada said, motioning for Malcolm to step aside. She opened her laptop and showed him footage from a nearby street camera. It wasn't high quality, but it clearly captured two figures in police uniforms near the cafe moments before the fire. One of them tossed something that sparked the flames. "This is them, Malcolm," Jada said. "Blake and Turner." Malcolm's stomach churned with rage. He'd suspected the officers were involved, but now he had evidence. Yet he knew it wouldn't be enough. The system wasn't built to hold men like Blake and Turner accountable. "We need more," he said firmly. "If we're going to fight this, we need to expose everything." Jada nodded. "I'll help. We'll find the proof." Over the next few days, Malcolm and Jada began reaching out to allies. A local journalist, Sarah Kim, agreed to write about the incident, framing it as part of a broader pattern of systemic abuse. Malcolm also contacted his old friend David, a civil rights attorney, who promised to help build a case against the police department. Meanwhile, Malcolm started talking to others in the community who had also suffered at the hands of corrupt officers. Each story painted the same picture: targeted harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. As they pieced together these accounts, the coalition began to take shape. Meetings were held in secret to avoid police interference. Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose, driven not just by his loss but by the collective pain of his community. "We're not just fighting for the cafe," Malcolm said at one meeting. "We're fighting for our future, for justice, for all of us." The room erupted in agreement. What had started as a personal tragedy was now a growing movement. Malcolm knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but he also knew they couldn't stop. The spark of resistance had been lit. Chapter 3: The Uprising. Malcolm stood in front of a crowd gathered at the empty lot where his cafe once stood. The burned remains had been cleared, but the scars of that night lingered in the air. He held a microphone in one hand and a crumpled piece of paper in the other, though he didn't need it to speak. His voice was steady, filled with the weight of grief, but also the fire of determination. "They thought they could silence us," he said, his words carrying over the crowd. "They thought they could destroy what we've built and scare us into submission. But look around you. We're still here, and we're not backing down." The crowd erupted in cheers. Among them were neighbors, activists, and even strangers who had heard Malcolm's story through the media. The article Sarah Kim had published had gone viral, exposing the systemic corruption of the police force and the targeted harassment against Malcolm and others like him. Protests had begun springing up across the city, and Malcolm, reluctant at first, had become the face of the movement. As the crowd chanted for justice, Malcolm spotted officers Blake and Turner watching from the edge of the street, leaning against their patrol car with smug grins. It only fueled his resolve. In the weeks following the fire, Malcolm's coalition had grown. Jada had uncovered more damning evidence, including hacked footage from police body cameras that showed Blake and Turner bragging about their involvement in the arson. Victims of police brutality and harassment began coming forward, sharing their stories in public forums and on social media. The tide was shifting, but the police force didn't back down quietly. As protests grew larger, so did the violence used to suppress them. Peaceful demonstrators were met with tear gas, batons, and mass arrests. Despite the danger, the movement only gained momentum. Videos of police aggression spread online, drawing national attention to the city's corruption. One night, as Malcolm walked home from a late coalition meeting, he found his front window shattered and a spray-painted message on his wall. "We're watching." He refused to let it break him. Instead, he turned the threat into fuel, using it as proof of the lengths the corrupt officers would go to maintain their power. At the next rally, he held up a photo of the vandalism for the crowd to see. "This is what they do when they're afraid," he declared. "They try to intimidate us, but they don't understand. We're not afraid of them anymore." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices a powerful force that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. As the protests continued, Malcolm's coalition filed a federal lawsuit against the police department, armed with evidence of corruption, brutality, and racial discrimination. Media outlets picked up the story, and pressure mounted on city officials to take action. For the first time, Malcolm began to see the possibility of real change. But he knew the fight wasn't over yet. The system was vast and entrenched, and victory would take more than protests and lawsuits. It would take unwavering unity and relentless determination. The uprising had begun, and Malcolm was ready to see it through to the end. The courtroom was packed. Rows of community members filled the benches, their faces a mix of anticipation and determination. The atmosphere buzzed with tension as Malcolm sat at the plaintiff's table beside his attorney, David. Across the room, officers Blake and Turner sat rigidly in their uniforms, their expressions carefully blank. Behind them loomed the city's legal team, armed with cold confidence. The lawsuit had reached its climactic moment. Months of relentless work had brought Malcolm and his coalition to this day, a trial that had captured national attention. It was no longer just about the arson of Bryant's Cafe. It had become a symbol of a broader struggle against systemic corruption and injustice. David stood, his voice firm as he addressed the jury. "This case is not just about a burned cafe. It's about abuse of power, about a system that has allowed these officers to operate with impunity for far too long. Malcolm Bryant lost his business, but this community has lost its trust in the very people sworn to protect them." The prosecution presented a damning case. Jada's evidence, now meticulously organized, included surveillance footage, body cam recordings, and testimonies from multiple victims of Blake and Turner's misconduct. The video of the officers laughing as the cafe burned had become the centerpiece of the trial, its stark cruelty undeniable. Malcolm testified with raw honesty, recounting the years of harassment and the devastating night of the fire. His voice trembled only once, when he spoke of the cafe's role in the community and the people it had brought together. He ended his testimony with a plea. "We're not asking for revenge. We're asking for accountability, for justice, not just for me, but for everyone who has suffered under a broken system." Blake and Turner's defense was weak, relying on technicalities and attempts to discredit Malcolm's character. But their arrogance, so apparent in the footage, undermined any sympathy the jury might have felt. Outside the courthouse, hundreds gathered in solidarity. Protesters held signs that read "Justice for Malcolm," "End police corruption," and "We will not be silenced." Speakers rallied the crowd, their voices echoing through the city streets. After days of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was read. Officers Blake and Turner are found guilty of misconduct, arson, and conspiracy to commit harm, the judge declared. Furthermore, the court recommends an independent investigation into the city's police department. Cheers erupted both inside and outside the courtroom. Malcolm exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the past months begin to lift. David clapped a hand on his shoulder. "This is just the start," David said. "The victory was a turning point, The independent investigation uncovered widespread corruption within the police department, leading to several officers being dismissed and systemic reforms being implemented. The city's leadership, under immense pressure from activists and media, committed to overhauling its policing practices. Malcolm's lot, once the site of destruction, became a symbol of hope. With donations and community support, he rebuilt Bryant's Cafe, this time bigger and stronger. The grand reopening was a celebration, attended by people from all over the city. As Malcolm stood behind the counter, serving coffee and greeting customers, he felt a deep sense of pride. His fight hadn't just reclaimed his business, it had ignited a movement. The flames that destroyed his cafe had sparked something far greater, a community's resolve to demand justice and never let injustice go unchallenged again.